What happened to the women when the shouting died down? Chronicles linger on kings, slain earls, and burning halls, but they fall silent at the threshold where captives were taken. Behind the clash of shield rims lies a quieter violence, a pattern that repeats from Lindisfarne in 793 to the English coast 2 centuries later. The hidden custom was no accident. It was law, market, and ritual all braided into one. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 870 records raids so fierce that whole villages were laid waste with fire and sword. Archaeology fills in what the ink leaves unsaid: shackles unearthed near Thetford, iron collars in York's layers, post holes marking slave pens beside the river fosse. Women seized from these raids did not vanish into the night. They became part of a human economy, their bodies binding Viking power as surely as silver or land. If you value history that goes deeper than the sagas admit, subscribe. It helps keep this work alive. Picture the smoke still rising above a thatched hall near the River Humber. Men drag livestock toward the beach, children cry. In the wreckage, women are pulled apart from kin, bound by rope, sometimes marched for days toward the coast. Sources from Ireland and the Frankish world describe how captives were divided, warriors claiming shares of plunder according to rank, while leaders kept the youngest or strongest as household prizes or for trade abroad. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, names Hedeby and Birka as markets where English women appeared among Slavic and Baltic captives. Their fate was transactional. Some were branded thralls, set to grind meal or weave sailcloth under a master's eye. Others were forced into concubinage, a practice the Gulathing law quietly acknowledges by setting compensation fines when a man's concubine was harmed, as though she were both partner and property. The record does not soften. In the Annals of Ulster, the year 821 tells of Vikings carrying off a great number of women from Howth. The phrase is bare, but its repetition across decades shows the pattern. These were not isolated cruelties, they were infrastructure, the shadow side of sea kingship. To raid was to replenish the household and the market alike. Material finds confirm the traffic. Balanced scales buried in Scandinavian graves suggest that women, like hacked silver, were weighed into the calculus of wealth. In Dublin, post-Viking strata reveal rows of longhouses where thralls once lived, their bones showing malnutrition and repetitive strain from grinding work. The women of English villages taken after raids were folded into this same system, their lives stripped to labor, reproduction, or sale. Yet not all evidence points to permanent bondage. Some captives married into the communities that first enslaved them, their children carrying both Anglo-Saxon and Norse blood. Place names in Yorkshire preserve hints of this mingling, but whether as thrall or wife, the line between coercion and choice was blurred by iron at the outset. The cliff comes sharp, for if the raid was only the beginning, what followed in the feasting halls of Denmark and Norway revealed even darker customs, rituals written not in chronicles but in law codes that measured a woman's worth in silver marks. The raid ended on English soil, but the journey of the captives had only begun. Bound together with rope or iron, women were driven toward the ships. The clinker hulls waited like beasts in the tide, their prows carved with staring eyes. Chroniclers note the plunder of cattle and coin, yet the truest wealth walked on trembling legs down to the strand. Ibn Fadlan, though he wrote of Rus along the Volga, provides the closest glimpse. He describes how slaves were herded aboard, like goats to the slaughter, women among them pressed into corners of the deck while warriors sang and drank. His account, though distant, mirrors what English villagers must have endured when the keels pushed off from the Humber or the Thames. The sea crossing was no reprieve. Salt spray, stung-bound wrists, seasickness weakened the body, and the captors reveled in their dominance. Some women were assaulted even before landfall. Archaeological traces in Scandinavia suggest this immediate violence. Women buried with foreign brooches, their skeletons showing signs of stress and injury consistent with forced migration. At Trelleborg, post holes outline barracks-like structures, perhaps holding places for captives awaiting dispersal. Once back in Danish or Norwegian harbours, division followed law. The Grágás, compiled later in Iceland but echoing earlier practice, states that plunder must be divided by rank and share. Captives, like gold, were tallied into the arithmetic of reward. Younger women often became part of the Jarl's household, not as equals but as commodities of prestige. Anglo-Saxon women, with their fine wool garments and distinct brooches, were valued for their novelty, an exotic proof of distant conquest. Markets gave structure to what raids supplied. Rebay and Hedeby show layers of commerce where combs, glass beads, and human beings were bartered alike. The trade routes ran south, where Frisians and Franks paid in silver for English captives. Dublin, a Norse town founded in 841, became notorious as a slave port. Excavations revealed chains, shackles, and the telltale wear of crowded enclosures. English women who survived the voyage might be sold there, vanishing into Ireland or ferried further to Iceland, even Byzantium. Law codes again speak plainly. The Gulathing prescribes fines for killing a thrall, setting their value at half that of a free-born man. A woman, however, carried both labor and reproductive worth. She might grind grain, tend flocks, or serve at feasts, but she could also be forced into bearing children who extended the lineage of her captors. Here, the private and public blurred. Captivity was not only economic, it was intimate, shaping bloodlines across generations. Skaldic verse hints at this, though obliquely. Poets praised kings for filling benches with foreign maidens. The tone is celebratory, yet beneath the poetry lies the unspoken truth of coercion. English women taken from their villages became symbols of conquest displayed in the hall. Torchlight on rough-hewn beams, horns of ale raised, and beside them the silent presence of the conquered. But captivity was not static. Some women found ways to climb within the hierarchy, aligning themselves with powerful men, gaining status as concubines or even wives. Others bore the weight of unending servitude, marked forever as thralls. This tension between survival and subjugation defined their existence. What awaited them in those halls was not just service or forced union, but ritual. For in the north, feasting and sacrifice walked hand in hand, and women stolen from English villages sometimes found themselves bound to darker fates when the gods were called to witness victory. The hall was the heart of Norse power, and it was here that the fate of captive women became entwined with ritual. Firelight licked the roof beams, smoke curling through the smoke hole as warriors laid out plunder before their chieftain. Silver arm rings, Frankish swords, hacked coins, and among them, living spoils. The chronicles describe treasure. The bones in Scandinavian graves tell us captives were counted alongside it. The sagas, written later, soften what happened in the hall, but law codes preserve the harsher truth. The Gulathing and Frostathing both allowed a man to take a concubine from among his thralls, provided he acknowledged her children. There was no question of consent. A woman torn from an English village might find herself thrust into the bed of a man who measured her value in marks of silver. Her body became another tool in the economy of kinship, producing heirs or swelling a lord's household with labor. Yet ritual overshadowed even this intimacy. Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Rus chieftain's funeral describes a slave girl sacrificed at the pyre, strangled and stabbed after nights of ceremonial drinking. Scholars debate the accuracy, but the archaeological record in Scandinavia supports it. Female skeletons buried beside high-status men, their manner of death abrupt, violent. Some had no local isotopes in their teeth. They came from elsewhere, perhaps from England, perhaps from villages that fell silent under axe and torch. The line between captive and offering blurred in these settings. A war bride could be paraded in the feast, dressed in stolen finery, then cut down when the gods demanded blood. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does not speak of this directly, but the silence itself is telling. The clerics who wrote it chose to record burned churches and slain monks, yet left unwritten the sacrificial aftermath, perhaps because it was too alien, too indecent to set in ink. Material evidence gives voice where ink does not. In Oseberg's burial mound, two women lay beside the great ship, one older, one younger. Their identities are debated, but traces of trauma linger. Was one a thrall sacrificed to accompany the other? Was she taken from far shores? The grave goods, rich and intricate, show the power of the household. The bones whisper the cost paid by those without power. Even in survival, ritual marked women. Feasts required servers, singers, dancers. The sagas recall maidens of the bench, foreign and nameless. They poured ale, carried meat platters, endured the groping of drunken hands. Their presence reminded all of victory, the living trophies of conquest. To drink from a horn filled by an English captive was to taste triumph. But the hall was not the end of the journey. From these gatherings, decisions were made. Some captives remained as concubines or servants, others were parceled out to retainers as gifts, and many were sent down the trade routes to markets that hungered for flesh. Dublin, Hedeby, Novgorod, even the glittering city of Constantinople waited at the end of this human chain. The cliff falls again here, for when English women left the smoky halls of Scandinavia, they entered the wider machinery of the Viking world, where human bodies were currency that reached from the North Sea to Byzantium, and where even emperors counted the worth of a captive girl. Beyond the halls of Denmark and Norway stretched the true engine of captivity, the slave markets. Here, the women torn from English villages were no longer personal trophies, but commodities in an international economy. Dublin, founded by Norsemen in 841, became infamous for it. The annals speak of raids feeding the town with great prey of women and children. Excavations on Wood Quay revealed traces of longhouses, bone pins, and iron fetters, all signs of a population living under compulsion. English voices must have echoed there, muffled by fear, reduced to bargaining chips in the hands of merchants. Hedeby, at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, served a similar role. Adam of Bremen calls it a place of vast trade where Slavs and Saxons, even Greeks, mingle. Among those exchanges were human beings. Balanced scales unearthed in graves there tell a story of calculation. Women and men priced like hacked silver, their bodies measured against coinage in a brutal symmetry. A young English thrall, healthy and strong, might be sold south into Saxony. A woman of noble birth, recognized by her clothing or accent, might fetch a higher price, bound for Iceland or Norway as a concubine or wife to a chieftain seeking prestige. The routes stretched further. The Rus carried captives down the great rivers through Novgorod and Kiev to the Black Sea. Ibn Fadlan describes slave women among these traders, some destined for the caliphate. Byzantine records confirm it, noting English and Slavic girls in Constantinople's markets. Thus, a woman seized from a burnt hamlet near York could, within a year, stand beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia, sold into households far removed from her own tongue and kin. The Gulathing and Grágás law codes make clear how normalized this commerce was. They detail procedures for selling thralls, obligations to declare defects, even rules about the children born of slave women. These were not exceptions, but part of daily life. A captive became both a unit of trade and a tool of reproduction, ensuring that her lineage served the bloodlines of her captors. The cold legal phrasing hides a human toll measured in generations. Archaeology supports the breadth of this traffic. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains in Iceland shows women born in the British Isles, their lives ending far from home. Some graves include both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon ornaments, mingled not by choice but by coercion. The genetic record in modern Iceland still carries traces of this, with maternal lines pointing back to the British Isles, while paternal lines root in Scandinavia. The legacy of conquest was inscribed in the body itself. Markets did not always mean anonymity. Some captives carved new identities, rising in households where their labor and loyalty brought favor. Others remained voiceless, buried without grave goods, their names lost. Yet every chain link and every weighted scale whispers their presence. The cliff hangs here, for once sold, not all captives remained within pagan hands. Some crossed into Christian lands, where their status could shift again, reshaped by baptism, marriage, or escape. In the kingdoms of the Franks and in Anglo-Saxon law itself, traces appear of ransomed women redeemed from Norse captivity. Their return tells us not only of survival, but of the high cost paid in silver and silence. Ransom was the narrow thread by which some English women were pulled back from Norse captivity. Chronicles note the practice again and again, though they rarely dwell on the individuals. In 878, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Alfred paying tribute, what the scribes call geld, to drive the Vikings from Wessex. Behind such terse entries hid human bargains. Silver was not only the price of peace, it was the currency of return. Women seized in raids could be bought back by kin, monasteries, or lords willing to empty treasuries. The law codes of Alfred and later kings confirm this. They set out the procedure for ransoming captives, sometimes stipulating the amount owed for a freeborn woman versus a thrall. The cold arithmetic reduced human life to a tariff, but it also opened a path home. Archaeological evidence at hoard sites, like the Great Quairdale hoard found on the Ribble, shows how much silver was in circulation during these years. That silver moved not only in trade but in ransoms, disappearing into the hands of Viking warbands while the rescued returned scarred and diminished. The Annals of Ulster tell of one such mass release. In 845, following Viking defeat, captives were set free in Ireland. Among them would have been English women, their ordeal carved into memory, if not into parchment. Monastic records hint at the trauma, penitential texts urging ransomed women to confess what they had endured, as though the stain of coercion was theirs to cleanse. Survival came at the price of silence. Not all were ransomed. Some remained in limbo, sold repeatedly, their identities dissolving as they crossed from England to Ireland, from Ireland to Norway, from Norway to the Rus. Even those brought back did not return unchanged. Families might accept them, but the whispers of their time among pagans lingered. In a society obsessed with honor, the violation of captivity cast shadows that no ransom could erase. Material culture gives us glimpses of their return. At Whitby, burials show women laid to rest with mixed assemblages of ornaments, some Norse, some Anglo-Saxon. Were these ransomed captives bringing back with them the trinkets of their ordeal, or were they women who had lived on both sides of the raiding frontier, half woven into Norse households before being reclaimed? The soil does not answer, but it suggests lives lived across cultural borders, unwillingly bridged by war. There is another layer. Church councils in the 10th century condemned the trafficking of Christians, yet bishops themselves sometimes brokered ransoms, their treasuries drained for the release of women taken from their congregations. The paradox was clear. To pay was to save lives, but also to fund further raids. Silver that freed a sister today might arm the ship that carried off another tomorrow. The cliff gathers here, for ransom was not the only path. Some women did not wait for silver to buy them back. Chronicles and sagas alike tell of escapes, of captives who slipped away during voyages or fled during battles, carving their own survival into legend. Their stories shift the focus from commerce to resistance, showing that even within the chains of captivity, some fought to seize their fate. Escape was rare, but it left its mark in both legend and lore. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is silent on names, yet later sagas echo with stories of captives who fled. One tale from Laxdala saga recalls Mel Corker, an Irish princess carried off in youth, who later revealed her true speech to her son. Though saga embellishment clouds the fact, isotopes in Icelandic graves confirm that women from the British Isles lived and bore children there. Some may have spoken of flight, others of endurance. The practicalities of escape were brutal. A woman chained in the hull of a ship had little chance until landfall. On marches inland, however, forests and bogs offered concealment. Law codes foresaw the risk. The Gulathing prescribed penalties for harboring an escaped thrall, warning free farmers against giving shelter. The very existence of such clauses proves that fugitives existed, that attempts to break away were frequent enough to demand regulation. Archaeological finds near defensive dikes in Denmark hint at runaways. Burials outside formal cemeteries, bodies without grave goods, may belong to those who died fleeing, nameless in foreign soil. A grindstone left abandoned in a field near Ribe suggests another fate. A thrall who fled her labor, caught and killed, her tools left where she dropped them. These fragments speak louder than parchment. Not all who escaped vanished into obscurity. Some were folded back into their native communities. A handful appear in charters where freed captives donated land to monasteries in gratitude. Their names are mostly lost, but the documents record the act. Land given for the sake of my soul and for my deliverance. Deliverance meant more than ransom. It could mean self-emancipation, a will stronger than rope. Yet, for most, captivity persisted. The rhythm of work defined their days, grinding grain, weaving, tending fires that never went out. Skeletal remains of thralls show compressed vertebrae, worn knees, the toll of repetitive tasks. Women taken from English villages were set to these labors, their backs bent beneath the economy of their masters. The cliff lies in the hall again. For though escape was a thread of hope, the greater fate was assimilation, a slower captivity that stretched across years until memory itself frayed. And it was in this blending of bloodlines, forced though it was, that the map of Northern Europe was quietly redrawn. Assimilation took many shapes. Some women remained thralls until death, their graves shallow and bare. Others bore children to Norse fathers, those children neither fully free nor fully enslaved. The sagas remember them obliquely, noting the half-blood kin of chieftains, often marked by foreign mothers. In Iceland, genetic evidence today shows maternal lines tracing back to the British Isles, proof of captives absorbed into the fabric of settlement. The line between concubine and wife was fluid. A concubine might, with time and favor, become acknowledged as a partner. The law distinguished them. A wife brought a dowry, while a concubine did not, yet both could bear heirs. Thus a woman carried off from an English hamlet could, by chance or cunning, become ancestress of a Norse family. But the path was carved by compulsion, not choice. The church condemned such unions, but it could not prevent them. Bishops wrote angrily of Christians joined to pagans, warning of sin. Yet when captives bore children, even Christian households often accepted them back, preferring blood ties to scandal. Pragmatism overrode doctrine. The scars of captivity did not vanish, but survival demanded silence. For those who became mothers within Norse households, life took on a grim normalcy. They spun wool, mended nets, taught their children songs half-remembered from England. These fragments of memory were seeds scattered into the soil of Scandinavia. Place names in Yorkshire Grimsby, Ormskirk show Norse imposition, but family names and oral traditions hint at a quieter English legacy carried northward by captive women. Midway through our tale, the truth must be spoken plainly. If you believe history should not look away from what the sagas bury, then consider subscribing. It keeps this record alive and honest. Assimilation was never uniform. Some women rose to quiet power, others remained forever marked as outsiders. Their descendants might forget the village from which their mother was stolen, but the mingling of blood ensured that England lived inside Scandinavia and Scandinavia inside England. Yet the story does not end in households. The battlefield itself, decades later, brought women face to face with new transformations when the sons of captives stood beneath Viking banners against the very lands their mothers had lost. By the 10th century, the children of captives were themselves woven into Viking warbands. Some sagas hint at warriors who carried Irish or English blood through their mothers. These men fought not as outsiders, but as part of the Norse machine, their heritage hidden behind axe and shield. Thus, the cycle of conquest fed itself. Captives became mothers, their sons became raiders, and England bled anew. Law codes preserved the tension. The Frostething states that the son of a thrall mother and free father might be freed if acknowledged, yet could still face stigma. In practice, many such sons earned their place with steel. The battlefield leveled ranks more quickly than the law. A warrior who proved himself might rise, even if his mother had arrived in chains. The Chronicles of England register the impact. The Danelaw emerged, swathes of northern England governed by Norse custom. In York, the mingling was visible. Christian churches stood beside pagan altars, and women of mixed heritage walked the markets. Excavations reveal brooches of Anglo-Saxon make buried in Norse-style graves. Identity blurred. Conquerors and conquered became kin, though the path was paved in coercion. Women, meanwhile, bore the brunt of this merger. They served as cultural mediators, teaching children both tongues, blending songs and prayers. Some households adopted Christianity through them, while others held to Thor and Odin. Archaeology shows crosses carved on pendants beside Thor's hammer. The duality often came from mothers who carried faith from their homelands into Norse kitchens, yet assimilation never erased trauma. Beneath the blending lay the memory of fire, loss, and forced migration. A song sung in the weaving room might carry a lament in a foreign tongue, long after the children forgot its meaning. The cliff turns toward faith now, for as Norsemen settled in England and Christianity spread in Scandinavia, the position of captive women shifted again, reframed by baptismal water and church law, yet never freed from the weight of their beginnings. Conversion changed the language of captivity, but not its reality. Missionaries preached that in Christ there was no slave or free, yet the practice of taking captives continued. The difference was legal. Baptized women could not be openly sacrificed or sold to pagans, but they could still be bound to households. Church law bristled against concubinage, yet chieftains persisted, cloaking their unions in Christian marriage when convenient. The Chronicles note baptisms en masse, sometimes after raids. The Annals of Ulster in 943 record Norse groups adopting Christianity, though often superficially. For captive women, baptism could offer protection, at least on parchment. A baptized concubine might demand burial in consecrated ground. But the abuse remained, sanctified now under a cross rather than a hammer. Archaeological finds echo the shift. Graves from the later 10th century in Denmark show Christian symbols, yet isotopes in the bones still trace origins to England or Ireland. Women taken as captives were buried under crosses, their foreign birth unspoken in the soil. The symbols changed, the power did not. The church itself sometimes perpetuated captivity. Monasteries bought slaves, some of them women, as laborers. The paradox is stark. The very institution that preached redemption profited from bondage. English women sold into Norse households might be baptized, then sold again to Christian lords across the sea. Captivity wore many masks. By the 11th century, the Viking world itself was shifting. Kings sought legitimacy through Christian order, codifying laws that moderated the worst of raiding, yet the old practices lingered in the shadows. Women remained pawns in alliances, traded as brides across kingdoms, their origins often erased. The cliff edges here with a name, for one woman, known from the sagas, embodies both captivity and survival. Melkorka, who claimed Irish royal blood, sold as a thrall in Iceland, yet who raised a son who became a chieftain. Her story, half legend, half truth, mirrors countless unnamed English women whose fates remain unrecorded. Melkorka's saga is exceptional only because it was written. Most women's stories dissolved in the anonymity of the market, yet their presence shaped the world. In Iceland, up to 2/3 of maternal ancestry traces back to the British Isles. This is not theory, but genetic fact. The legacy of captives, including English women, is inscribed in DNA. The sagas occasionally lift the veil. They tell of women silenced at feasts, mocked for their foreign speech, yet whose sons and daughters inherited both tongues. These fragments confirm what archaeology and genetics declare. The Norse world was built not only on conquest, but on incorporation of the conquered. But memory was selective. Skalds praised kings for victories, not for taking thralls. Clerics bewailed heathen violence, not the quiet endurance of the enslaved. The voices of women themselves are absent, yet their influence endures in the blended culture of the North Atlantic. Place names, dialect words, weaving patterns all carry echoes of England, carried north by unwilling hands. As the Viking Age waned, the practice of seizing women did not vanish overnight. It transformed into feudal marriage politics, cloaked under Christian law. The brutality of raids was replaced by arranged unions, yet the absence of choice remained. Women continued to be moved as tokens of power, though the ships no longer burned villages on departure. The cliff pulls tighter, for the story of captives is not only about what was done to them, it is about how their endurance reshaped nations, binding England, Ireland, and Scandinavia into a shared bloodline that no sword alone could forge. By the late 10th century, the pattern was visible across England. The Danelaw was not simply a zone of occupation, it was a place where families of mixed heritage thrived, the legacy of earlier raids. English mothers, taken as captives, had birthed children who now tilled the fields, spoke Norse in the marketplace, and swore oaths to Jarls. Archaeological digs in York's Coppergate reveal layers of this mingling. Anglo-Saxon combs beside Norse beads, spindle whorls used by women of both traditions. The material culture shows continuity rather than rupture. Behind it lay centuries of forced assimilation. The women who once walked in chains had become the mothers of towns. The chronicles give only glimpses. They record treaties, such as Alfred's agreement with Guthrum, which established borders and laws. Hidden within those laws were provisions for marriage, inheritance, and property realities shaped by the presence of foreign-born women now absorbed into society. The transition from captive to matriarch was rarely acknowledged, but its consequences were vast. Without these women, the Norse settlements in England could not have rooted themselves so deeply. Their bodies, their labor, their children anchored the conquest. The cliff moves now toward the endgame, for as England rallied under stronger kings, and as Norse power faltered, the descendants of captives found themselves on both sides of the battlefield, torn between bloodlines forged in violence. The 11th century brought the great collisions. Olaf Tryggvason, Svein Forkbeard, Canute the Great. England became both prize and home for Norse dynasties. Within this turbulence lived the legacy of captive women, invisible yet central. Canute's court, recorded by chroniclers like Thietmar of Merseburg, was a blend of English and Danish custom. His marriage to Emma of Normandy is famous, yet beneath royal unions lay countless quieter ones, born of earlier raids. English women taken decades before had by then become grandmothers of warriors standing in his shield wall. The paradox was sharp. A woman carried off in 980 might see her grandson fighting against the land of her birth in 1016. The cycle of conquest and assimilation came full circle. Blood once taken as plunder now wielded power. Archaeological finds from this period confirm the integration. Graves at Repton, tied to the Great Heathen Army, contain women buried with both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon artifacts. There may have been captives or descendants of captives, their identities fused beyond separation. Yet the practice of seizing women did not vanish entirely. Chronicles of later raids still speak of captives, though increasingly these were condemned by Christian kings. Law codes of Ethelred and Canute speak against the selling of Christians, evidence that the trade persisted even as moral pressure mounted. The cliff grows sharper, for the Viking Age was closing, but the scars it left on English women remained etched in memory, law, and lineage. As the 11th century waned, raids gave way to dynastic struggles. The Norman conquest in 1066 eclipsed the Viking Age, yet the patterns of captivity lived on. The Domesday Book records thralls still present in England, their status barely different from that of earlier captives. Women continued to serve in households, marked as property even under Norman lords. The echoes of the Viking practice lingered in law. The term thrall gave way to serf, but the essence remained: women bound to land, labor, and lords. The violence of sudden raids was replaced by the slower violence of feudal obligation. The legacy of what the Vikings had done persisted, reshaped by new masters. Archaeology confirms continuity. Chains, collars, and tools of bondage appear in context beyond the Viking period. What began with fire and axe endured as quiet subjugation. The women once dragged to ships became the template for a broader system of control. The cliff narrows now toward memory, for though the sagas remembered kings and battles, they forgot the captives. Their silence is itself a monument, one we must read in bones, laws, and landscapes to recover the truth. Memory failed the women, yet their presence cannot be erased. Genetic studies show that the maternal lines of Iceland and parts of Norway carry heavy traces of English and Irish origin. These women, taken in raids, became the silent architects of nations. Their cultural imprint is subtle but real. Weaving patterns in Norse textiles echo Anglo-Saxon methods. Words in dialects of northern England show Norse-English fusion, many likely carried by bilingual children of captive mothers. The map of Europe itself was redrawn not just by ships and swords, but by the wombs of women taken in war. The cost was immeasurable. Trauma, erasure, generations living with the shadow of violence, yet their endurance reshaped history. England became part of Scandinavia, and Scandinavia part of England, not only through conquest, but through bloodlines born of captivity. The cliff stands on the final edge, for if history forgot them, we must speak them now, to close the circle with their names unnamed, yet their presence undeniable. What did the Vikings do to women after raiding an English village? They bound them, sold them, forced them into labor, marriage, concubinage, even sacrifice. They turned human beings into currency, into lineage, into silent pillars of empire. The chronicles record the battles, but the truth lives in shackles unearthed in York, in isotopes tracing foreign birth in Icelandic graves, in law codes that priced women in silver. The sagas do not tell their stories, the church barely whispers them, but their endurance is written in the faces of descendants across the North Atlantic, in the mingled bloodlines of two worlds. The true aftermath of Viking raids was not only death and fire, it was generations of women surviving inside a system that sought to erase them, yet who, through survival itself, reshaped nations. If keeping this history alive matters to you, subscribe and leave a trace in the comments. Memory depends on voices willing to speak what sagas silenced. These women cannot be named, but their truth can still be carried. And so the shields are silent, the halls collapsed, the market's gone. Yet in the silence, the breath of those women lingers, reminding us that conquest is never only a story of warriors. It is the story of those who endured when the swords were sheathed, and who left their mark not in poems but in the blood of Europe itself.